Are we live?
We're live.
Great.
All right.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to yet another Straight Up Hangout. This week we have with us, from left to right, Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107, Lindsay
Hello.
DiLoretto from Double Secret Agency. We only hear of one of his secrets today, though. Matt Stein from Working Concept, and I'm Ben Friesick from Barrel Strength Design. Our topic today is tools for getting started with plugin development, and we're going to talk through the topic and look at a couple tools around that. The general conversation is going to take place from the perspective of front-end developers getting more familiar with plugins and some of the tools that we can use to start doing that. And we're going to try to have a bit of a broader discussion on why Craft plugins are structured the way they are, why Craft is structured the way it is, and where we can use plugins in that workflow. So let's start. I'll hand off to Andrew. Andrew created pluginfactory.io, which is a pretty powerful tool if you're getting started with plugin development to select what parts of a plugin you want to get started with, and it generates a nice base plugin with a lot of comments to help you get started. The biggest challenge is knowing which buttons to press when you pull the tool up.
Well, that's always the biggest challenge, isn't it?
All right. Yeah, it definitely is. So, Andrew, tell us about pluginfactory.io, or if you'd like to start a little sooner than that in history.
Yeah, I think I'll take a little step back and just talk about. So we're kind of gearing this discussion towards people who are front-end developers. Maybe have a little of experience doing PHP. If you've already written a ton of plugins and want to find out how to get your custom element working, this is probably not the discussion for you. This is for people who are front-end developers who are interested in perhaps making their first plugin or understanding how to more efficiently make them. And I think it makes sense to take a little step back and talk about why you might want to make a plugin in the first place. Lindsay, what would be an example of why I would want to make a plugin?
Oh, that's a great question. There's basically two reasons that I can think of off the top of my head. Is something that can only be done in PHP is a great reason. And the other reason would be if you start piling up a lot of twig logic, that starts to feel excessive, and suddenly you're looking at 20 or 30 lines of twig logic just to figure out what data you're working with. That's something that would be much better handled in a plugin and then passed back to the template to deal with after that.
Okay, so something either you can't do with Twig or something that is more efficiently done with Twig. And I'll tell you, my kind of first experience with Craft was, oh wow, this is great. This Twig templating is so much better than a lot of the other templating engines that I've seen out there for other CMS systems. This is awesome. I kind of come from a traditional programming background, so I liked the freedom that Twig gave me to kind of do whatever I wanted. And then not too soon after that revelation was, oh man, this sucks. There's something really simple that I want to do, but I can't do it in Twig. Why can't I just dump a little PHP code in there? So let's talk about why I can't do that.
Yeah, that's inherently a bad idea. I mean, these are the WordPress days, right? You're like, oh, I'm writing some HTML and I need to do a quick PHP thing. Let me just shove a PHP tag in there. That is not okay anymore. That was okay 10, 12 years ago when WordPress was getting started, and WordPress sadly still does that. Craft took a very smart approach and did not do that. They used Twig instead to relay this stuff, but you got to get out of that WordPress mindset if you're still in it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not even WordPress, right? Because Expression Engine, there's a little checkbox that you can say allow PHP. And then you can just kind of dump and sprinkle PHP wherever in your code that you want. But from a architectural point of view, let's talk about maybe why this is not the best way to handle things. And I'll give you kind of my take on it. Is in a way it's kind of cheating. It doesn't force you to formally structure the problem and abstract it away into something that you're actually going to be able to reuse, right? You're just kind of hacking things and saying, well, to get this working, I'm going to stuff this line or two of PHP in here. It's not going to be, not a lot of thought will have gone into the architecture of this thing. I'm just kind of stuffing it in there to make it work. And I think Craft has chosen a pretty smart path by saying that there is a hard division between the front-end templating, and if you want to do anything code-based, you have to use kind of our formalized APIs for doing it. Does that make sense to you? Is that something you agree with, or?
Yeah, I think that's actually a smart. It's a smart breakdown. It's really this division between. It's a division of concerns, right? You have the front-end developer concern, the design concerns, and then you have the back-end business logic, the hardcore processing concerns, and they should be separate.
Right. Yeah, and something that. Go ahead, Ben.
Twig is created with this in mind too. It's worth noting that Twig, if you look at the repo, the Twig repo, or the philosophy behind Twig, it's meant to be a templating language. It's not meant to have a lot of logic. And you'll see conversations in the issues on the GitHub project where somebody says, I want to be able to do this in Twig, and the owner of the project says, nope, too much logic, that's a programming thing, that should be in programming. I think it's interesting to note, so the cool thing about Twig is then Twig says, but we'll let you extend the language and add new tags that allow you to provide different types of data to your templates to use our tools, and that becomes powerful in the sense of Craft, because then Craft is able to extend Twig with its own internal plugins and add more functionality that we get out of Twig to begin with. So some of the common tags we might use in our templates, even like the switch tag, are things that Twig itself thought were too much logic for the base templating language, but Craft felt were important enough in the CMS world that they should be in the base product Craft.
Sure. Yeah, and I think the division to some people new to this might seem arbitrary, but I think it's actually an incredibly good one, because, again, what it does is it forces you to actually sit down and think about the problem and write it in such a way that you're going to be able to use this in your next project, potentially, because it's forcing you to write the plugin as this modular piece that can then be plugged in. And it's the same with Twig plugins as well. And that's something that you don't get if you're just tossing, random PHP into your templates, which, they really shouldn't be there anyway. The business logic really shouldn't be in the front end templates. And I'll give you, a really quick horror story, and then we can get on to actually doing this. So I had a client who their WordPress site was falling apart, and he asked me to take a look at it to just see if I could get it to work. And when I logged in to look at it, I said, where is the site? There were no posts or pages or anything like that. And I kind of dove into it, and what it ended up being was the custom theme that they have. They had one massive 10,000 line PHP code that did a big switch looking at whatever page you're on and spat out different PHP code based on that. So if there was a single mistake anywhere in there, the whole site just fell over and died, right? And I think that is a really good example of how not to architect things. And the way that Craft and Twig do it, they are forcing you to architect things well. And just like a kid that doesn't want to take their medicine, it's good for you. Trust me. Take it. It's the right way to do it.
But I think an important thing to understand too, like I came at Expression Engine with a design background doing only front-end templates, and so the thought of, okay, so I can use the HTML and CSS I know, but put these funny tags in and hook it up to like a powerful CMS, that was a cool thing. And being a designer and a learn by breaking things type, I would jam PHP in and just kind of hack things together. And so coming at it from that perspective, I feel like Craft can seem kind of like torture when you just want to create a quick little plugin and suddenly you have to figure out what these different classes are and stuff. But what was really helpful for me to understand is that it's not just take your word for it, you make a lot of plugins. It's an extension of good design. And good design is something that's reusable, and it's the same aesthetic design principles that are applied to the system that I'm now working with. And bridging that gap was a huge deal for me to understand why all the pain of learning how to make plugins well and learn, what objects are in classes and stuff like that was actually worth it and worth my time.
Yeah, for sure. And actually your perspective is great because, coming at it from the angle you're coming at it from, you're saying, why are they putting me through this, horrible stuff? But it's people with experience architecting software saying, no, trust me, you want to do it this way,
The cool thing, too, I think that we're going to see here as we start to demo these tools is, Matt brings up a good point, is like, well, how we go from our front-end templating world into all of a sudden we need to know about classes and objects and who knows what, and it could be very intimidating at first. But I hope what we learned today is with the right plugin template in place, you actually get the benefits of creating a little space where you can work just like you would have been throwing the code into your template. And you don't need to know about all of those concepts. You might just need to know about a single function in PHP that you return back to your template. And you can start small and grow in complexity of plugins over time. With the right tools, you can generate the shell of the plugin that kind of does the heavier lifting for you at the beginning.
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's really fair. Is you really start from a place of, hey, this logic doesn't belong in Twig, or this is too much, or this is something that can't be done in Twig. And so you extrapolate it out into a PHP plugin, and then it grows, and then it starts to become its own thing, or you intermingle it with other business logic. And if it starts to take on a life of its own and be a self-encapsulating thing, this happens all the time. People say, oh, I just want a plugin that does this, or I just want this little feature, and they shove it into their own little plugin, and then before they know it, it's a full, fleshed out concept. And so then these people take the concept, take the plugin, they put it up on GitHub, or some people put it up for sale. But whatever they do with it, they end up with something more modular. So this is kind of like what Andrew's saying. Like you can take the idea out of the template where it doesn't belong, and you put it in its own little package where it can grow and be its own self-contained concept. And then that is something that you can use on other sites with all of the features that you have now built into this module.
Yeah, for sure. And if what you end up doing is what I talked about before, where you just throw random PHP through your template, you don't get any of that benefit at all. A concept that has been around in the programming world for absolutely forever is code reusability. That's kind of the holy grail, that if I write this thing, I want to be able to use it again somewhere else. And if you're just sprinkling, PHP statements or even business logic via Twig into your templates, it's not going to be that easy for you to reuse that because it's fairly tied to the actual template and project that you're working on. If you abstract that away into a plugin, you are forced to make something that is modular. And like you said, to think about this problem in an abstract way so that when I write something, let's say there's a piece of functionality. For one of the sites I was doing, I wanted to be able to post to Twitter and Facebook from within the site, right? I was familiar with a service called Buffer. I could have just written something custom for the site that I was doing, but it would be difficult for me to reuse that in future projects. So instead, I made a Buffer plugin out of it that you can use and I've reused it in dozens of sites since then. That you can use to when like a new entry is posted, tweet about it and post it to Facebook. And had I not approached it from that point of view of let's turn this idea into a plugin, I wouldn't be reaping the benefits now of when I start a new site. I just grab this plugin, stick it in, and away we go. So I think you make a really good point, Lindsay.
Cool. Hey, do you want to give us a quick tour of Plugin Factory?
Okay. So one of the more, at least to me, annoying things about making a plugin is that you have to get all the naming right. There are a whole bunch of different pieces that can go together to make a plugin, and the files all have to be named right. The classes all have to be named right, and there's a basic structure that needs to be followed. And when I was first approaching this and trying to make a plugin, I had numerous times where I would write what looked right, and then the plugin would just do nothing. And it was because I had, one letter was lowercase when it should be uppercase, or something really pedantic like that. And I said, well, I really would like a way that I could just spit these things out. And that's really what Plugin Factory is you go on to pluginfactory.io, and I will bring that up in just a second. And in fact, you know what? Why don't we switch to it now?
This issue you're talking about being consistent with the naming pattern, specifically capitalization, is something I see people run into all the time. All the time. I mean, literally yesterday on Slack, there was somebody who probably spent 20 minutes trying to debug what his issue was, and it was a capitalization issue.
Right.
There's various components within the plugin. Camel casing is important in spots. All lowercase is important in spots, and it really helps to know what matters when and where. And that's one of the glorious things about Plugin Factory is it really solves that problem for you.
Yeah, and especially if you are coming at this from the point of view of, you're a front-end developer or designer, I mean, I could definitely see how this would start to get pretty annoying, right?
Yeah.
Why won't this just work? I just want stuff named the right way.
Yeah, just do it already. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, come on, just let me do my thing. So why don't we, if we want to switch it over to my screen sharing, and hopefully you guys can.
There's a little green arrow on the left. I don't know if you saw that.
Well, I am sharing the screen.
Yeah, you're sharing. You're live.
Oh,
yeah.
Copy that.
Don't worry, the computer's turned on. Everything's so what do I need to do to make my video be shown? Or
no, I've got you selected. And to our audience out there, if you have any questions while this is happening, please post them to the question and answers sidebar, and we'll try to get them rolled into the conversation here. So, yeah, you're visible on Andrew. I'll keep it that way.
Okay, so this is the website, and it's pluginfactory.io, and you can see the first thing that you get to pick from here is an API version. That doesn't do anything right now. When Craft 3 comes out, they're changing the format of things. There'll be an API for that, so you'll be able to pick it. We actually had someone come into Slack who had an issue where he was getting some JSON in, and it was already HTML entity encoded, right? And he needed a way to decode that JSON, decode the HTML entities. And there was no native way in Twig to actually do that. So I said, all right, hang on a minute. Let's whip something up for you, and I'm going to kind of recreate what I did for him there. So we'll enter our plugin name here, and you can enter whatever you want for the description, an initial version, and an author name. Sure. And the those fields are all required, okay? And the GitHub name is if you're going to be releasing this on GitHub. This is your username on there. Some additional information gets filled in if you do that, such as in the releases.json and get documentation URL and all that stuff. Tweeted out is just whether Plugin Factory's Twitter account should tweet out that, hey, I just made this cool plugin. I threw that in there just because I thought it was kind of fun to be able to see the stuff that people are working on. And now if I do nothing else, this will actually generate a valid plugin for me. The plugin component section lets me pick and choose what pieces of the plugin I'm going to be working on. In this case, all that we really want to make is a twig extension, and it gives you a little handy tooltip here. So this is all that I need. If we were making something else, and Lindsay will talk a little bit more about that later on for plugins that do a little bit meatier stuff, this is where you can turn on, yes, I want a controller, I need a model, and you can create as many as you want and name them, and it will generate everything for you. On the back end, this is actually using a Yeoman generator that I wrote, which is open source, and it's available, and you can check it out and all that. And all I will do is click on Build My Plugin, and it just downloaded it for me. It says your plugin scaffolding has been created, and that's the important thing to note about this, is that it really is scaffolding. What it is creating for me is a framework in which I'm going to implement my plugin. And I'm just bringing it up here. Sorry if my machine is being slow, guys. There we go. What is going on? Of course, right? Decompress.
Live coding.
Death over here.
Ay.
Style points.
All right.
On a side note, I love those spinning gears.
All right. Good thing I've got a contingency plan here. All right. So this is the plugin that it generated. And it actually fills in a whole bunch of stuff for you. All of this is generated by the plugin factory based on the name of the plugin that you gave it. It will then take care of all of this stuff for you. It fills in, this is the main plugin file, which is required for every plugin. It gives you the name of it. It puts in, you can see my name and the copyright date and the URL and all that kind of good stuff is filled in. Because we asked it for a twig extension, it creates a method that says add twig extension, and it imports the twig extension framework for us that it created. And it also creates a default license for you. It creates a default markdown README that you can then fill in with whatever you want. It includes some resources by default that you need an icon for it. It includes a generic image to show you where you might put images. The releases.json file is for allowing Craft to show that, hey, there's a new version right in the admin CP. So when you release a new version, you can just update this, and everyone that has your plugin will get notified that there's a new version of it. And then the real guts of our plugin is our twig extension, because we're just adding, we want to add something that will decode HTML entities. And it creates this nice little PHP file for us. Again, all of this information is filled in. Anywhere you see these little snip lines, it's just documentation that when you're ready to ship your plugin, you can just delete it. But as you can see, it makes a nice little twig extension class for us here. And this is where we specify our method. So we want to write a twig filter called unescape. And when you invoke unescape,
Andrew,
it will
can you
actually
increase your font size a little bit for folks?
Yeah. How do I do that in Sublime?
Command plus, maybe?
Nope. Nope. Oh, there we go. There we go. Tell me when it's good.
A couple more, maybe. A little bit
more? Okay.
That's good.
All right.
Wait.
So the real takeaway, I'm not trying to teach you how to make this particular plugin, but the real takeaway from this is to take a look at, and let me make this window, there we go, take a look at how all the scaffolding is there for you. This is all stuff that the plugin factory will generate for you, and it's all the annoying things about, I don't want to have to name this properly, that properly. It will take care of all this stuff for you. In a Twig extension, there's a method called getFilters, and that's where you say this command, right here, this unescape command, is a Twig filter method that calls this function, right? And it's the same thing here for a Twig function, and then you can see down here, here's my actual method that ends up getting called to do our decoding, and it's super simple. All it's doing is calling PHP's HTML entity decode. But now, once you install this plugin, in his templates, he can just do bracket unescape, and it will do the HTML entity decoding for him. What the plugin actually does is a lot less important than the concept of if you use Plugin Factory, it will generate all of this stuff for you.
It might be worth noting, too, Andrew, that you've done a nice job at providing additional documentation in the files and a handful of examples. What you really need here for the Twig filter is two of those files that get generated. One, the main plugin class file, and the other, right, the Twig extension class file. So a lot of those files are in there, and they're handy to get familiar with things, but they're also they're overkill in the sense that your plugin can be much simpler. And frequently, when you're doing a simple Twig extension or a variable, you might just have a two-file plugin that has that primary class and a variable or a Twig extension that's helping you do something a little bit nice.
Right. And in every one of the files that Plugin Factory generates for you, like as you mentioned, it does include some documentation, and I also tried to include links to the appropriate full documentation for that thing on craftcms.com so that you can actually read more and kind of figure out how to do it. But I think the important thing is to start using a tool like Plugin Factory because it takes the drudgery out of making this thing. You just kind of log in and you say, I'm going to need X, Y, and Z, and you click Build It, and then you can actually hit the ground running to create the plugin that you need to make.
Another thing that I really appreciate about it that you mentioned very quickly are just being able to hover over the little question marks next to each thing. If you're new to making plugins and you don't even know what the thing is that you need, it's really convenient just to look at everything that's available and tick off the things that you want.
What is this task thing, and would I actually need it for anything? Yeah.
Now, is this a good segue into Lindsay talking a little bit more about what all those buttons might mean?
Yeah, I think you can probably take me off of the screen sharing there.
Yeah, let's here. I'll take the screen sharing. And in fact, before I segue into the components completely, I'll okay, I'm gonna screen share. I don't know if you're getting this.
Yep.
I'll kind of walk backwards from Plugin Factory, which is pretty awesome. Before there was Plugin Factory, there was the Business Logic plugin template, which kind of does a lot of the same stuff that Plugin Factory is now automating. The Business Logic template was really born out of a few of us on Slack chat talking about, man, it's a pain to spin up a plugin just to do some really simple stuff. And so just kind of on a whim, slapped this together, and shockingly, it hasn't changed much in 2 years. If you want to read about it, feel free to go here and read about it. But the basic premise is this: it really has a controllers, or it has one controller file. It has the resources is just an icon. It has one services file and it has one variables file. And within those, like Plugin Factory, it's documented on why it would exist and how you would use it. So it's simpler. It's much simpler than Plugin Factory and what it consists of. But again, it's 2 years old. But I'll also say this: for a lot of business logic needs, where hey, I just need a quick snippet of data, this actually is pretty suitable. or I just need a quick AJAX action to a PHP behavior, this is still a suitable solution. So business logic aside, let's jump over to this little diagram. So this diagram is something that I put together when I was learning how to make a plugin. And so it evolved. The more I learned, the more I sort of honed and crafted this until I got it to a point where it felt pretty right. Now, before I jump in here, let me say that this is not an illustration of every plugin ever. As you could clearly see with Plugin Factory, there are some components that you want sometimes, some components that you don't want sometimes. There are different reasons for these things to exist. What this is a diagram of is a kind of generic plugin that would kind of cover a lot of ground. So up at the top here, you've got the client computer, right? If they want to, let's say the user wants to put data into the website via a form or via an AJAX trigger, or even by following a route. You can use routing in Craft to actually trigger actions. So if you're following a route or filling out a form or hitting an AJAX trigger, that's going to basically lead you down the path of pinging a controller. Controllers handle how incoming data and incoming requests are handled, but it doesn't necessarily do the most complex stuff. When you get to the most complex stuff, you're going to want to be dealing with services. I would say so many roads lead back to services. In fact, you can kind of see this from the diagram where it's sort of in the middle for a good reason. Somebody, I want to say Stephen Lewis, wrote an article about why you should be careful using services, and it's a good article, and you should definitely read it. Services are, one thing to know about services is that they are the API of your plugin. So if another plugin wants to talk to your plugin, they're going to be doing it through your services. And this is great if you're doing that on purpose. If you want your services file to be an open API where another plugin can call your services and say, hey, I need this behavior to happen, boom, perfect, you've laid it out beautifully. But there are times when you might stick something into a service and not be aware that that's how another plugin would talk to yours. And this is where Stephen Lewis's article is actually pretty helpful, because he talks about offloading some of this to helpers, which is not in this diagram, and I'm actually not going to dwell on that point.
Yeah, so I think it's an important point to make regarding this chart, and the way Craft and the underlying framework Yi are created is basically what's called model view controller, right? And that's sort of the underlying concept of the way everything works, and it's really simple. The model is your data, okay? So your data is one separate island. The view is how that data is represented to the end user, who can actually see that data. And the controller is what actually lets you change or manipulate that. And it's a really nice way of abstracting things so that you don't end up with everything all jumbled together. You've got your model, which is your data. You've got your view, which is the representation of that, the visual representation of that data. And you've got your controller, which performs some actions on that. And that's the way that Craft, Yi, and the plugins are all kind of structured. So.
On that note, yeah, I think that's spot on what Andrew's saying. And when you break it down into that MVC, approach, which it really is, some parts of it are easy to identify, and some parts of it are hard to identify. So identifying the view is like, well, that's this client box up at the top. And identifying the data is, well, you've got your models and your records and, of course, the database. But then the controller is not just necessarily the controllers. It's sort of this whole layer here. I'd even say, and because I don't feel like I am an expert in MVC, so I don't want to dwell on that too much. But I will say Adam McCombs had a great slide in a presentation he did last year where he basically took standard Craft plugin components like these and laid them out into a more comprehensible MVC translation, and it was actually really interesting. I don't know where that slide is, but I'm sure he can dig it up for us at some point.
I think of variables as the controllers of our templates, kind of. They're kind of Some people visit templates and logic is performed, and the variables are the thing that hand things off to the service layer and start doing the logic, and other things are requested via forms and AJAX and such, and the controllers are what capture that, do a little preparatory logic, and hand things off to the service API and to perform the big.
So do you want to go through the kind of list of major components in a plugin and what they are? Does that make sense to do at this point?
Let me kind
We
of
gotta wrap up. Go ahead. Go ahead.
one, and then we'll go back to that. So when you've got you can submit data through Forms AJAX. You hit your controller. The controller would probably mostly interact with services to do most of the heavy lifting. Variables, as Ben just mentioned, are basically how your Twig templates would get their data. So a Twig template isn't going to be hitting PHP directly. It'll basically be hitting it, well, it'll be hitting it through your variables. So whatever variable you create, variables are very often just wrappers for service methods. Not exclusively, but it's pretty common for that to be true. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about models and records for a minute, because there's a lot of confusion, especially when you first dive in to plugin development. What's the difference between a model and a record? Because one thing you'll notice right away is that models and records look very similar. In fact, there are many cases where they're nearly identical. And so people say, well, why do I have two? And there's a very simple reason. Records can talk to your database. Models cannot. You do not want something existing in, say, a variables class or a controllers class. Those should not be talking to your database. So the only place that that records should be interacted with is in your services class. So your services class can talk to, can use records to communicate with the database, but if you want to pass that data around anywhere else, you'd really be doing it through a model. So, you know, your controller could kind of put together a model based on the data that it has, pass it off to a service. The service can use that to figure out how that data interacts with the database through a record. Maybe you take that data and you want to call to it from a variable and pull, now it's a model again, and pass that off to a Twig template. You can see that models interact with everything. Records really only interact with services. And I think that's the end of this for me.
All right. Yeah, that was great. I think that diagram does a kind of nice job visually showing the connection between these things. Why don't we, if you want to, well,
Lindsay,
we don't
is that diagram posted anywhere? I think I saw it on one Stack Exchange post somewhere once.
Good memory. That's really the only place. I've been meaning to post it for like years. I'm like, I got to post this somewhere. But
If you want to write an article for Straight Up Craft, let me know.
Yeah, I can certainly do that. It needs to be posted somewhere that's not just my machine or this one random Stack Exchange post.
I think it's going to be available in a YouTube video after we're done here.
Good point.
So let's just go through real quick the different components that kind of make up a plugin and why you might need to use them. So something that is in every plugin is the core plugin file itself. And we showed that briefly with the generator, I'm sorry, plugin factory and the plugin that it generated. And all that file really is it lets you set the version number, the schema number, and there are a few other things that it sets in there. But that is the core file that every plugin has and needs. And then I'll just kind of go down the different components that may or may not be in a plugin depending on whether you care about it.
Actually, Andrew, you know, on Plugin Factory, there's a little up at the top. There's a link that says like "Show how it all comes together." So I forget what it says. And
yes,
that
show me.
pulls up a picture. Do you want to share that? Because that really shows all the files that get created.
I will share my screen. I don't know how up to date that picture is, but it's pretty up to date.
Close enough.
Google Hangouts would like to share the content of your screen. Let me make sure I get the right one. Otherwise, there could be serious problems here, guys. Looks like that one. There we go. So we should see Plugin Factory up there, right?
Yeah, there you go.
And
Show me. That's what it was.
yeah. So there's this little show me link, and I left it disclosed so we could do the big reveal, live on camera. Make it exciting. There we go. So that's an example of all of the stuff that Plugin Factory can create for you. And actually, I see one thing that's missing on there is console commands. But this gives you an idea of kind of the overall structure of a plugin, and there's a lot of stuff that may or may not be included in there. So actually, let's just keep this up and kind of go through it right here. So console commands. This is something that most people are not going to use, so I won't spend much time on it. But you are able to make commands that run via YC. I don't know how to pronounce it right. YC? I don't know, whatever.
Sure.
But you can run...
None of us will try. We'll just go with your version.
Yeah, YC. Basically, it lets you run commands from the command line that spin up a full Craft instance. So, you can do fun things like uninstall plugins from the command line. There's a whole bunch you can do with that, but that's relatively esoteric. The next thing that is up is controllers. Controllers are typically what people use them for are, let's say there is a front-end request for submitting form data. Well, you would catch that in a controller. If there's a front-end trigger for starting some kind of operation, a controller would have methods for handling that. So they're kind of ways that things from the front end can be handled or triggered on the back end. And you'll see in a number of cases here that there's a place where you can give it a name. This is because you can have a number of different controller classes in your plugin. You can have as many as you want. And you do that really just to logically divide things up. One controller might do X, the other might do Y. You might want to have them in separate classes. It's too bad these are in alphabetical order because the order is actually terrible. The order is actually terrible, but it is in alphabetical order. So element types are kind of first-class citizens in Craft. They are for instance, the listing of assets, the listing of entries. Those are all element types, and I won't get too deeply in those because those are relatively advanced to be able to make. And the next item up here is field types. If you want a custom field, for instance, Lindsay has a plugin that handles making Google Maps for you. And you can just add that as a field type to any of your sections. Then you would want a field type. And again, you can have as many different types of field types as you want in your plugin. So if you have custom data that needs to be stored, you would use a field type for that. Go ahead.
There's field types I just call them like middle ground plugins because they get a little more advanced in how you're working with the front end and back end, but they're still fairly simple. And there are a handful. I was thinking we could note if we know of any simple plugins, just if anybody's looking to start on one of these. So I know we have a Sprout Fields plugin out there that has several different field types, and some of those are very simple field types. I think there's various other notes field types out there, and very simple one use case field types that are great starting places if you're getting into field type development. You can definitely make it a lot more complicated, but
I think Ben's pretty spot on when he says it's kind of like an intermediate thing to attempt, because a field type can be very simple but can very quickly become complex. Another simple-ish example that popped into my mind was Eli Van Zoren has a URL field, right? Mm-hmm. So it's this simple thing where, hey, it's a field, it does something simple, but then again, one of you guys, I think Andrew just mentioned the smart map, has an address field, which is actually quite complex. And it's evolved over a couple of years to become more complex. So as an intermediate type of plugin, field types are fun. As the flip side, field types are really fun.
Yeah, and Ben makes a really good point. Craft takes care of a lot of the work for you when it comes to field types. And I think he also made another really good point, which is that, well, first of all, Plugin Factory provides a great framework with some documentation for you to get started, but a great way to learn how to do a lot of these things is to look at examples of what other people have done. There was actually something that I was trying to do, and I remember I actually bought one of Lindsay's plugins just so I could look at it to see how he was doing something. So that, if you're interested in doing any of these things, looking at example code of someone who's already done it is a great way to get started on it. But field types you can think of just, if you have some kind of custom data that you want people to enter into into the back end in their sections, then you would use a field type for that. Models are kind of the core of a lot of things that you'll do with any more complicated plugins. They are how you represent the data that your plugin works with. And that is not necessarily mean that this data is saved anywhere, right? You can have a model that represents something that you work with in your templates that's never saved anywhere. It's just a way to represent the data that your plugin and potentially the plugin developer uses.
Keeping that data consistent or validating it. And we did last week's Straight Up Hangout was on what is a model, if anybody's interested in.
Well, then I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Totally covered. Purchasables is something exclusive to Craft Commerce. It's a special element type that implements a few protocol methods, such as get description, get price, etc. So if you want to make custom purchasables that can appear in your Craft Commerce cart, that is when you would use purchasables, and this will create all the framework and stuff for you for that. Records, as we discussed before, are very similar to models, except that they are how your data is actually saved into the database. And whether that's into your own custom table or whether that's using Craft content, records are what make that data actually get saved out.
Now,
go ahead.
Now, is there any good simple example of a plugin? Because I actually think in the case of field types, if you have a simple field type, you don't need to have your own record because your data will get stored in Craft's kind of default way. But if you have an advanced field type, like something like the Google Map field type Lindsay has, or another type of complex, like the SEO plugins that Andrew and I work on, I would guess a lot of the field-related data there we can't store in the default Craft way, and you need to have our own tables to manage that. But is there any simple plugin we can think of with a record?
I didn't do my homework.
Yeah, I mean, one of the only ones that's popping into my head, and I'm sure there are many, many others, is a 404 Finder has a separate has records.
Oh, nice. That's a good one. Yeah.
For good reason. You're racking up it's basically the 404 Finder keeps track of what's pinging your 404 page, so you can go back and examine it later. And it's that's too much data to shove into a normal Craft field. So what it does is it basically uses a record to create its own table full of 404 data, and then when the plugin is doing its thing, it's referring to that table instead of your normal Craft content table via records.
Yeah, I guess a good way to put it is that records are there if you need them, but for a lot of plugins, you just create a field type and Craft will handle storing your data for you.
Some of the redirect plugins out there actually might be good simple record use cases, because they're going to have the need for one table for the redirects that they're managing, and each time you save a form, you'll be saving to that table instead of somewhere else in Craft. So.
Yeah, so I guess a question that people might be thinking of is, well, when would I use a record as opposed to just letting Craft store this for me? And I think a division would be, either it's not, Craft can't store the information that you need in the Craft content table, or just for efficiency reasons, like you're talking about with the 404 plugins, where they're going to have a ton of entries, and you don't need all of the kind of framework that you get if you implement it via field type and it ends up going through the Craft content table. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, that sounds about right. If
All
it's
right.
too much data for a single field, it's probably going to go in a record.
Yeah. Okay. And let's move on to services. So as you mentioned earlier, Lindsay, services are kind of where the guts of a lot of your plugin is going to end up being if it's doing anything remotely complicated. A lot of the other parts of the plugin will end up just calling down to the service. So, for example, let's say that the plugin that we created earlier, the HTML entity decode, let's say it actually was doing something pretty complicated. In this case, it's not, but let's say it's a really complicated process that it's doing. What I would do is I would actually write a service that did that complicated op. My actual Twig code would just call the service to do it. And the reason you would do it that way is, first of all, there may be other parts of your plugin that will need to do the same thing. For instance, you might have a variable that we'll talk about later that would need to do it. Maybe you have a task that, maybe this is a thing that needs to be done over time. The task might call to do it. Maybe it would be triggered by a controller. Maybe there would be some kind of external thing that causes this complicated operation to happen. And that's really where the guts of your code is going to be, is in a service.
I think that's a great point, and to kind of tie back to what I said earlier, services is where you would create an API for other plugins to talk to your plugin.
Yep.
But what Andrew just illustrated is that it's also the API for your plugin to talk to itself.
Right.
A lot of the heavy lifting. Anytime if a controller needs something, it's talking to a service. If a variable needs something, it's talking to a service. If a task needs something, it's talking to a service. Most roads lead back to services.
Yeah.
The service might be I think of it too as maybe if you're building up in simple to complex plugins, it might kind of be the third file that you come across, because you get your main plugin class file, then you get your variable or controller or twig file that you need to handle the data, and then you're going to be handing off that to a service. And the fourth or third or fourth other file you might need is a model. If the data that you're receiving in one of those first or the second files has structure to it and you need to maintain consistency, you package it in a model and then you hand it off to the service, and the service can do more advanced things and knows
Right.
the format of the data it's getting in.
And getting back to what we discussed earlier, services are also the only things that should be talking to your records in terms of saving stuff out. So please don't make a variable that ends up calling a record to do stuff. It's just not the right way to do it. Let's go on to settings. So the reason there is a separate little toggle switch here for settings is I didn't want to create more stuff that you didn't need and would end up deleting. Settings are, and I've got this right over here, settings are if your plugin has settings that you want people to be able to configure on the back end. So for instance, I'll click on sitemap here. These are the settings for the sitemap. And they're just sort of back-end user controls for setting various things on there. Probably not too much to talk about there. Tasks. Sorry, go ahead. Did I go too quick?
It's worth, I was just going to note, Craft has a default way of managing simple settings, like
Right.
Andrew showed there. And so it's also worth noting, Craft also supports a plugin-specific config file, config.php
Right.
in your plugin. So if you're really just building a bare-bones plugin, you don't even know what your database should look like, you could just add an array to a config.php file in your, or is it config? Yeah, I think it's config.php.
Well, so in your website, in your plugin, it's config.php and it's in the root.
Yeah.
But when somebody uses that on their website, they would copy that into their config folder and rename it all lowercase your plugin name. So a
Yeah.
great example is SEOmatic, right?
Well,
So,
got it, got it.
so SEOmatic has a config file along with its settings, and in the SEOmatic plugin root is config.php with the
Yeah.
defaults. And then you
I
take
get.
that. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, no, I go on, finish your sentence.
I was going to say you take that config file, copy it into your config folder, rename it SEOmatic, all lowercase, SEOmatic.php, and then you can override those defaults with whatever you want. And one of the great things about that is it's environment aware. So if you want to use the same multi-environment config that you would in your general.php or your db.php, you can apply that as well to these PHP config files.
Yeah, my point was more if you just wanted a quick and dirty database that didn't even need to be edited, or a quick and dirty settings area that didn't even need to be edited in the control panel, there's this config.php file which is in your plugin. Then the next step is what Andrew shared there, is like Craft has a way to manage simple settings, and as soon as you have the need for tabs or something else in your settings, then you're pretty much building them like you would any other page in your
Yeah.
plugin.
And I don't want to scare anyone off with all the nerd stuff. You don't need a config.php. But
No, you
it is,
don't. Fully
yeah,
optional. Very few plugins actually have them.
yeah.
That's,
But it
that's
is
just a way to do the wrong thing the right way, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, they are pretty handy, and I think
Well,
Lindsay might be the one who made me put it in SEOmatic, I think.
Because
you
I
know,
needed something that was environmentally aware.
Oh, okay.
I didn't bring them up to make them esoteric as much as we recently. I noticed that a lot of people, when they develop things, they get stuck on settings and building them out, and sometimes you're doing a proof of concept or
I see.
something, and you don't even know exactly what you need in settings. So it's a really low bar way to just give yourself a variable that you can tweak while you're building a plugin, and later decide where do I want to put these settings in the UI for somebody to be able to edit.
Gotcha.
So.
All right. So again, settings are user accessible settings that they can change in their control panel. And then let's move on to tasks. So tasks are actually something that I've seen a lot of people kind of abuse. But what tasks are is, let's say there's a long operation. And PHP, it's running on a web server, and there's a timeout. It varies from web server to web server, but let's say it's 30 seconds is a reasonable default. And let's say you're doing some very long task, like you are importing a ton of records into Craft, or to use an example that Craft does via task, you're regenerating your image transforms, right? Well, what you would do is you would write whatever code does the image transform in a service, and then you would create a task. And what the task does is it separates this down into individual steps for doing this huge operation, right? So let's say we're importing 2,000 records. The task would tell Craft, hey, I've got this 2,000 step thing that I'm doing here, and Craft will call the task one step at a time. Well, it's actually up to you how many steps you do, but let's just say, for simplicity's sake, one step at a time. It will call your task. Your task will then get the next record that needs to be imported. It will import one record, and then it will return. And then Craft will call it again, and eventually it will handle all of the conversions, the import of the records into your database by doing it one little piece at a time. And the reason for doing it that way, again, is you can't have a really long CPU-intensive task that just runs forever, because it's going to time out on most web servers. Is that a reasonable explanation of it?
Yeah. Tasks are, I think that covers most of it. I think the other thing to understand about tasks is if your plugin needs to do stuff in the background on a regular basis. People see tasks all the time, like deleting stale templates, or these are tasks that Craft has, and then you can write your own task. But it's basically background tasks that you don't need to trigger manually.
So a very simple example for a custom plugin that I wrote for a site. Um, I have reminders that get kicked off based on various dates for things that are happening, right? So I have a cron job that pings a controller, which is my external trigger, and the controller then runs the task. And the task iterates through every user on my site, and if there are any pending reminders, it then emails them a reminder. And it does that one person at a time in the background. And it's a perfect example of when you might use a task for something.
Mm-hmm.
Another example is, you'll see these in the Craft control panel. We're all probably familiar with stuck tasks from time to time. If you say you create your channel and it has a certain URL structure to it, and then you go, or your section, and it has a certain URL structure, and then you go back, you create a few entries, and then you go back and you change the URL structure of your channel, you've created a situation where the entries that are already saved have a different URL structure than the section settings now do. And what Craft will do is trigger a task that says, after you're done saving this section, go through the database and update every one of those entries to have a URL that matches the new URL format.
Right.
So if you're dealing with larger plugins where you might have settings that affect the entities you're working with, you'll run into needing tasks for something.
Yeah. So again, a higher level way to think of it is just if you have a lot of stuff to be done, and it can be broken down into a number of steps, then it's a really good candidate to be a task. Whether it's importing 2,000 records or converting 1,000 images, or just something that's very lengthy, you would then divide it up into little chunks and have the task handle it chunk by chunk. Whatever it is. So let's move on to Twig extensions. So Twig extensions are your chance to extend Twig. In the example we showed earlier, we added a escape Twig filter, unescape Twig filter, which would HTML entity decode some text coming in. But Twig extensions are probably one of the first things that a lot of people do as a plugin, because they have some kind of thing that they can't do in Twig. So they write a plugin that will interface with Twig to allow you to do that. And again, a very typical pattern is that you write the guts of what the thing does in a service, and you have the Twig extension then look for whatever you want to name this new operator in Twig, and it will then end up calling your service to do the guts of the operation.
I'll say this about the Twig extensions, and you're right when you say a lot of people dive into that pretty early on. I was reluctant to dive into that too early on because there's a lot of nuances to it. The way that the plugin refers to its Twig components is there's actually like 2 or 3 different places where the plugin kind of needs to call it. In fact, it needs to pull in Twig itself, if I remember correctly, in order to do that stuff. I think if you want...
Plugin Factory does that for you.
Plugin Factory does that for you, which is wonderful. Yeah, exactly. So you don't even have to think about it too hard if you're using Plugin Factory. And if you're not using Plugin Factory, a good one to backwards engineer is Marion Newlevant's MN break and continue. It literally adds the break and continue tags to Twig.
Yeah, there'll be a handful of like entity decoding type ones out there too that are usually just like one function when you get into them as well.
Yeah, and I will say that there are different levels of writing Twig extensions too. I mean, if you're just writing a simple command like we've demonstrated, then that's relatively easy. If you're actually writing a node parser, which you need to do for block level things, like I've got a minify plugin that is a block level tag where you say minify and then end minify. That's a little more involved. That requires some serious nerdery to get that working.
Which I think, now that I think about it, break and continue probably falls into that, because what those plugins do is it generates the PHP that's going to be spit out into the...
Yeah, if it's a block level thing where it's there's a begin and an end to it, that's where you end up needing the node parsers.
Mhm.
Twig extensions are interesting because they're a Craft plugin, which is actually a Twig plugin also.
Right, right. It's basically, if you write a Twig extension, someone can just dump that into a generic uh, platform that uses Twig, and it will work. And all the Craft plugin really does is it's a Craft way of loading that extension into Twig.
And it's worth noting too, Craft itself extends Twig a lot. If you
Oh
go to
yeah.
the docs and the functions and filters area in the templating reference, they'll say at the top, on the top of the template, functions that come with Twig, Craft provides a few of its own. And that's pretty much saying that they have written extensions to Twig in this same way. And if you dig into the app folder a bit, you can find some of those examples. But
Oh yeah,
they,
for
they
sure. I
don't
mean,
write them in the same way as your plugin format.
For the lazy and ambitious, it's important to note that the opposite of what Andrew said is true. So if you write a Twig extension, somebody else can drop it into Twig in any other system. If you find somebody out there that's made a beautiful Twig extension that does exactly what you need, you can bring it right into Craft, and
yeah.
mission accomplished.
Yeah, that's very true. And the point that Ben made, it's definitely true that Pixel and Tonic eats their own dog food in terms of, hey, we've got this great Twig platform, but there are a couple additional things we wanted to do. Let's just write a Twig extension to do it. And there's a bunch of functionality, like Paginate is another example of a Twig extension that they wrote specifically for Craft. And I found that in my own work, and I'm sure you guys have too, that a lot of the plugins and services that I end up writing are because I have a problem that I need to solve. And then I end up writing something, and because of the way that Craft forces me to write this as a abstracted plugin, it ends up being something that I can then share with other people, and they can use it too. Or I can reuse it in my existing projects. So again, that gets back to the discussion we had earlier, that kind of the way that Craft forces you to do the right thing ends up being really beneficial to your future self as well as other people. All right, so let's move on to variables. Actually, you know what? I'll say something briefly about variables, but Ben, you had some interesting points on them. But variables are essentially a way that via templates you can call down to your plugin. For example, you might have something like, and this is the way that you would use it in a template, you might have something like craft dot SEOmatic dot encode URL or something like that. And that would end up calling down to your variable that then calls a service and then does its thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap between what variables are capable of and what Twig extensions are capable of.
Yes.
And so, it's hard for someone new to know which is the best approach. But it's a little easier to dive into variables and then figure out later on whether or not that should really be a Twig extension.
Yeah, the way that I approach this stuff, and it may be wrong, but it's the way that I've been doing it, is I just make as many different ways for people that want to access the functionality of my plugin. I give it to them. If they would prefer to use variables, then that's fine. Do it that way. So, for instance, for I've got a buffer plugin which ends up sending updates to buffer. You can use the Twig extension part of that by just saying, bracket send buffer update. Or if you like using variables, you can do craft.buffer.send buffer update. And really, it's just a different syntax for doing the same thing.
And Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, those both lead back to a shared service, don't they?
Yes, they all lead back to the shared service. And I do it that way because, from a templating point of view, I figure let people write stuff the way they want to write it. If they prefer syntactically to do it via variables, then let them,
Yeah, that's legit.
Go
Is
ahead.
there any performance difference otherwise? I mean, is it just a matter of interface, or is there some hardcore argument to be made for using one over the other?
I have not
Aside
done
from design.
I have not done any performance testing on it. I would guess that the overhead of calling a variable might be slightly better because there's one less layer to go through. You're not going through Twig in the Twig extension, but I don't know that for a fact. That's just kind of my instinct. You would have to do, it would have to be an operation that you did a ton, and then you measured the performance in a loop. And I haven't done that, so I really don't know.
I was
I
just
think
curious.
I think Andrew's instinct is probably right on this one. I think variables would have just a slightly lower overhead because you're not going as deep into Twig. But all that being said, Twig in general will parse down into PHP. So whether you
Right.
used a variable or a Twig extension, once that gets parsed down into PHP, there really should be no difference.
Yeah. It's a matter of how efficiently that gets translated down. And I just don't know the answer to that because I haven't done it. My guess is that it just really doesn't matter because most of the stuff that you're going to be doing is not going to be, some kind of huge or some kind of operation in a loop of thousands. But, I could be wrong. And let's go on to widgets. So widgets are things that are displayed on the front in the admin dashboard. And I think I have my handy little site here that I can bring over. Yeah. So these are examples of widgets. These are from the analytics plugin that just kind of shows you who is visiting your site from where. And this creates the framework that you need to create widgets for your plugin.
Cool thing to note with widgets are another good starting place if you want to get into a control panel style plugin development. They're simple and fairly contained, and you can probably find, I don't know which examples are out there. Craft has several that you can kind of look at in its code base. I don't know of any off the top of my head.
Go ahead, Ben.
Go on. I was going to extend that and say that Craft 2.6, which just came out, added some new behavior that we can use in widgets too. It added D3JS and a charting library, so widgets can, like Andrew showed with the analytics widget, it's using charts based on the data that the plugin knows about. Well, our plugins can start using similar data there too. And it sounded like from the comments in Slack when they released that feature. So the person whoever doesn't know this, Ben David, who created the analytics widget, is also the person who's doing a lot of the design for the Craft control panel right now, and probably the one who had a lot of hand in how that charting library got implemented. And I believe it sounded like he might even be updating the analytics plugin to use Craft's API for the charting, so that all of our plugins will be able to have consistent charting styles in the Craft control panel, which would be really cool.
Yeah, and they're using D3, which is pretty amazing because anyone who's familiar with that, it is a pretty powerful data visualization plugin. And they've also made and I haven't delved into this yet, but they've also made a chart helper class to help you do simple things with D3.
Yeah. Yeah, so that'll be really cool to see evolve over time and how other plugins start to use that layer.
And Ben, I found a simple example of a widget that people can look at. It's called Content Stats.
Oh, cool.
It's made by Will Brower, who, by some strange coincidence, happens to be my brother-in-law. No nepotism going on here. Okay. But you can check that out. It basically is a dashboard widget that gives you some stats on how many different posts to different sections and all that kind of stuff that you can have laid out in your dashboard. And it's probably a pretty good example to look at for a widget that is relatively simple but does useful stuff.
Great. That's great.
Well, we have managed to go this entire time without a single person having a question. And, from my perspective, that means we did such an amazing job that no one has any questions.
Clearly, we have
covered
given them all the answers already.
Well, Craft will not stop for us. There'll be new things next week that we'll have to figure out.
So, Matt, is there anything you think that we didn't cover that maybe we should have talked about, or was it too nerdy, or did it? What do you think?
No, no, I liked it. I mean, for me, it's always interesting. The chart actually was really helpful, and I made the connection finally that I think a variable is like the same thing as a. I'm trying to imagine the chart. Its twin is on the other side of that chart, on the other side of
Let
service.
me pull it back up. It's the controller.
Variable, yeah. So a controller is to input as a variable is to output. Yet it's still at that like service layer of brain.
Really, variables are a way to call your service
Right.
or call parts of your plugin from a template. Yeah.
I think of it as when you post a form, you have post data that gets submitted to the browser, and your controller has access to all that post data to make sense of and hand off, whereas your variable has access to all that post data in your template, but it also has access to whatever other variables you have in your template, which kind of can be handed off to that variable as the data that it knows about that gets processed.
I was just inspired. I feel like their roles are different, but similar at where they are in the flow. The chart.
And Lindsay made a good point too. Is that Twig? I mean, if I were Twig, what do you call them? Functions and filters kind of fall in that variable layer too. Is it's in your template, it's taking in data somehow from that template, and then it's pretty much acting as a similar vested.
Yeah, you can write an entire plugin that users can utilize from a front-end template without doing any Twig extensions at all. And you just do that through variables, and that's a sort of a template API to your plugin. And really, people end up doing the Twig extension portion of it just as a convenience, because it's kind of nicer to just type unescape as opposed to craft unescape filter unescape.
In fact, a real-world illustration of that is my language link plugin. The original way to call that was like craft.languagelink.renderlink or something like that. And then after I kind of got my head around Twig functions a little bit better, I just wrote a function. So now you just do LL, and that's the exact same thing.
Right. Yeah, so it's just, another potential reason to use variables instead of a Twig extension is namespacing, right? You're never going to run into an issue where it's in the same namespace because it's craft.yourpluginname.function. Mm-hmm. Whereas potentially with Twig extensions, someone could be using the same token. It's possible. Probably not very likely to happen, but it's possible.
It's unlikely, and then it's up to Craft to resolve that. I think Craft would just go alphabetically, but I don't know if it would be the first one or the last one that wins.
Yeah, but from a convenience point of view, at least from my perspective, it's easier for me to just have a very simple Twig filter, because when I'm templating stuff, I don't want to write craft.pluginname.function all over the place.
So it's really verbose.
Yeah, I mean it's more explicit, but it's, when you're doing a lot of front-end templating, it's kind of annoying. So, Matt, anything else that we didn't do well?
No, I appreciate that you made, I've learned from watching all you guys do things. So it's been, I really appreciate that you made Plugin Factory and that there is something that, you can kind of learn by tinkering and seeing what the pieces are.
Well, you paid your monthly membership fee, right?
That's right.
All right.
What is it now? One Git commit is the monthly membership fee?
Yeah, I'm joking for everyone out there who's watching. It's totally free to use, and the underlying Yeoman plugin Yeoman generator that actually creates this stuff is also open source. So if you want to check it out or contribute to it, you're more than welcome to.
Now, Andrew, if we have a secret plugin we're working on and we want to benefit from Plugin Factory, are we going to reveal to you what our secret plans are, or do you track data of what's happening in the plugin for yourself or for the public?
The little tweeted out switch is there that if you don't want it tweeted out to the public, then it won't be. In terms of analytics or data, it does keep track of the name of the plugin, but I think that's it.
I mean, to be honest, you're not really telling Plugin Factory a whole lot. You're telling it the name and who you are, and then maybe kind of what kinds of components it's going to use, but it says nothing about, how you're going to implement those components.
Actually, this is good. We can do this real time. I think. If my computer is going to cooperate, we can look at the actual Google Analytics event that it sends, because honestly, I don't remember. Plugin Factory. Oh, right. Plugin Factory actually uses a custom plugin to do some of its stuff. So let's just bring that up. Plugin Factory services. Okay, that should be it. All right, so here is some, when I find the...
What's the analogy for that? It's like the dog food making itself.
Yeah, right?
The plugin factory workers have unionized.
EA. I realize this is really boring for everyone at home, but let me just see if I can find it really quick. Oh, come on. It's almost like I didn't write it, and I don't know where any of this stuff is. What's going on?
I bring that up and just because I know some people are working on something special, and you never know where these data serve it, or who's tracking what about you. So it's a powerful tool, but it's also available on GitHub. So if you really had an issue putting your data into it, you can download it and run it from the command line on your own.
Yeah, if you want to, you can just download the Yeoman plugin, and you can just do it that way. You know what? I think I actually did something smart, and I actually put this in a JavaScript. So site init. Oh, this is embarrassing. I don't even know where any of this stuff is.
To be fair,
so it's
I have
pretty
trouble,
private.
Yeah, I have trouble remembering code that I always say I have trouble remembering code that I coded more than 24 hours ago. So if
I know it's in
more
here
than a
somewhere.
day, I have no idea what I wrote.
Oh wait, here I think we're actually.
We do want to see how the stuff is represented to Prism.
Yeah, right.
The Prism.
GA.
It's just so he can organize the drone strikes.
There it is. I found it. So what it sends is the plugin name and the author name is what it sends to Google Analytics on the back end.
So you can keep track if the same person is creating the same plugin several times.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that is one of the reasons why I did that. I wanted to see how many people were constantly reusing it for the same thing, because then maybe the workflow isn't the best because you have to re-enter stuff every time.
So my workflow is I try it, and then I find a bug, and then I email you the bug.
Right.
And then you fix it, and then I try it again, and then we rinse and repeat.
That's only happened once, okay?
Okay, that happened once.
Don't turn it into this thing, okay? Because
Can we just generate a plugin and say the plugin doesn't work yet? Andrew, can you fix the plugin for us?
Yes, you can do that, and I guarantee you the response will be silence. Okay? But yeah, I mean, you make a good point that it does send that info to Google Analytics. It doesn't save anything interesting. It's just and actually, the way that the plugin is, the way that Plugin Factory is written, is immediately after it generates the zip for you, it deletes it because I don't really need or want that sitting on my server. So the only information that is saved is the name of the plugin and the author name, and that's for my own purposes. But yeah, if you're really concerned about it, you're working at the NSA and you're doing something super top secret, you can just grab the Yeoman generator, which is the back end guts of it, and you can just use that, and that doesn't do anything. That just generates it locally.
In other news, the NSA is using Craft now.
Are they really?
No, I'm just kidding.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, they might be.
The list is growing.
I don't think they're allowed to use anything more than a text editor inside there.
Yeah.
Maybe WordPress, though.
Probably WordPress. That's probably where all the Snowden docs came from.
On that note, thank you, everyone, for coming out today. I think we learned a lot, and hopefully created a nice reference for people getting started with some plugin development there. We'll try to do this again under a different name sometime.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
Yeah, for the end of the show notes here, next week, anybody interested, the topic is eager loading elements, a new feature in Craft 2.6, but something that gives us the possibility to save ourselves hundreds and hundreds of database queries. And this has been a Straight Up Hangout. We're here weekly on Fridays. Hope to see you next time.
Bye-bye.